Welcome to the weekly duck migration forecast, episode 7 for the week of 16 through 22 November. Before we get started, I want to make a couple comments. I apologize if there's any audio issues. I'm working with relatively older equipment. I know I need to update, but just not in the budget this time to get that done. One of the things I noted recently on YouTube that I was unaware of is that after 1,000 subscribers or 4,000 minutes of people watching a channel, I can actually sell advertisements, or YouTube will put advertisements on there. And that can generate some funds to possibly, just cover my time on this. There's no real funding for this. I do this, because I enjoy it. It keeps me up to date about duck migration, which is a lot of the research I do anyway. But it would be helpful to have a little bit of cash to actually maybe upgrade my equipment next year, or maybe even later this year, so that I can get a little bit better audio and video quality going. So I guess that's a shameless plug for please subscribe. Just please understand, it'd be nice to cover some costs in general. So appreciate you just thinking about that, and appreciate everybody that's been listening to the channel. Remember, you can email me your questions at weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. I keep getting really good questions. Really appreciate it. I like the interaction with the user group here, so keep them coming. This week, Justin from Kansas City, Missouri asks kind of a twofold question. I'll try to cover both of them. Are there any data like your weather severity index that indicate a reverse migration? As in, are there thresholds when ducks would move back north? Reverse migration is something we talk about, but I don't think we quantify very well, even as scientists. We think it happens, but I'd say that in general, we don't have a lot of really good empirical evidence for it. I think a lot of the discussion is anecdotal, because we do see these cold fronts that occur. We get snowy conditions, birds move out seemingly. There's a decrease in numbers of birds at a location. And then if there's a big melt in a southern wind, those birds seem to show back up. So those birds can be moving back from southern locales into northern locations. Or it could just be that birds locally had concentrated because of relatively severe weather and then redistributed locally. So does it seem like that sometimes there's an increase in abundance after a warm spell in an area where birds had decreased previously? Yes. Is that specifically reverse migration? I would say I don't know, and we do not have a threshold for that at this time. So what I would look for is severe weather, snow, and then a massive melt, which would create habitat for birds, and maybe they would come back to a location which they were previously familiar with to continue to feed. And then the second question is, for my area, where would you look to see if a migration is coming? So let's go to the map of where I generate these. Justin said he kind of looks at, Des Moines, Iowa, and Memphis and difference. And if you look at where Justin is at, and I guessed at where Kansas, Missouri was. Hopefully it's in Missouri and not in Kansas there. But you're right, to split the difference kind of between Des Moines and Memphis. There's a large difference. I mean, Memphis is on there because sometimes we get these really, really cold shots that will force birds really down into the southern Mississippi alluvial valley, out of that kind of Boot Hill, Missouri, and Reelfoot Lake area in northeast Arkansas, where mallards concentrate, and it will push them into those Louisiana and Mississippi latitudes in greater abundance for a period of time. I would look to North Dakota, because you do get, like when that cold front came across the mid-continent previously in October, that early cold front, that pushed birds pretty far. I mean, Tennessee, Kentucky picked up birds, the Boot Hill in Missouri picked up birds, and even mallards out of that. So you can look as far north as that when there's good cold fronts. But then, I would say Des Moines, Iowa is a good barometer as well. So when those thresholds hit blue in Des Moines and they're not quite there by you, you can expect probably some birds to come in. The other thing, if you remember from last week's episode, we got a question about kind of a similar question. And if we're just talking mallards and black ducks, right? This is the curve of the change in relative abundance as the weather severity increases. And if you look at the top or asymptote of that curve there, the birds seem to pile up and increase as the weather gets severe, and then at some point they start to decrease, right? So the greatest increase in abundance between any 2 days, or two counts for that matter, would be a mean temperature of around 41 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 5, or sorry, 41 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 degrees Celsius. So you can also look at your own mean temperatures, take the um, the high and the low and average those and see if you get around 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And those should be relatively good days. In combination with looking to the north, there also has to be some type of a cold front, those blue colors in North Dakota or Des Moines, to probably really push birds strongly. So thanks, Justin. I think those are great questions. Keep them coming, and appreciate all the questions from everybody. One of the things I want to highlight right now is that there's a big disparity in what's going on snow cover wise, and that also has to do with temperatures between the west and the east. I mean, the west has been relatively cold, and that has pushed into North Dakota, and down to Iowa at some points. We see that swath of cold that runs up into northwestern Ontario. And folks on the Atlantic coast have seen, around the Great Lakes region and say in New York where we're at, and even into Pennsylvania, seen some push of mallards. And I really, there's a lot of new information coming out, some of it published, some of it not published yet, that show that there's a good number of mallards produced in kind of northwestern Ontario that may be coming towards the Atlantic coast. And so I really think that the mallards that we've derived along the Atlantic coast, the actual movement of a lot of those birds is coming from that cold in kind of extreme northwest Ontario and maybe a little bit south above Lake Superior there, that is probably pushing birds in. But if you really look at Canada snow on November 15th, 2020, and then compare it across the years, which I'll do here in a second, right? If we look at this, it's kind of a flip of that last slide where the east at this time last year had a lot of snow. Now this did melt, and we had a tremendous number of mallards and black ducks, even up into central New York, well into December, right up till a little bit after Christmas, and river flooding that occurred because all of this snow did melt. But if we look at Canada, on southern Ontario and Quebec, there would have been a really good push of birds by this point last year. All of our early ducks would have moved out. Our mallards and black ducks would have started to move in. And the west was relatively dry, so it's kind of a swap from last year. But if we go back to 2018, right, we still see Ontario and Quebec. The western provinces, I'm guessing, were at least cold enough to have pushed birds. So it's cold and snow, but the snow was pretty substantial in 17, kind of same thing. That line is pretty much the entirety of Canada in 17. And so we really have a situation in 2020 where we have an absence of snow for the most part in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyway for this time of year. Now, if we go all the way back to 2016, which is the year that I tend to compare this year to, that was extremely mild. Now, we're better than that at this point. But again, if you go back to my most recent bonus episode, I give my outlook for long term, and we're looking snow-wise in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyway much more like 2016 at this point than we are those other previous years. So my thought continues to be that we're looking at a relatively mild year with a trickle migration. Who knows? We might get some shots of cold that really move birds at some point, but the outlook continues to not look great, and the year continues to look like 2016. So what's the summary for migration for this week? I'd say a limited mallard migration this week in the Mississippi flyway, and your best bet would be early in the week, and little to no migration of mallards and black ducks in the Atlantic flyway for the coming week. There's a short-lived cold front early in the week in the Atlantic flyway, but it is enough to push some dabbling ducks other than mallards and black ducks south this week from Canada and the Great Lakes region to points farther south. The strongest push of those birds is predicted around Tuesday and Wednesday. But then temperatures are back in the 50-degree range as far north as central Minnesota and the Mississippi Flyway by Thursday, and Ottawa, Ontario, and the Atlantic Flyway by Friday. So again, a little cold shot, but not a lot to make a lot of birds move, and not a massive cold front to really move things. And if we look at we'll look at the last slide with conditions. Water conditions changed drastically in rivers in some locales since last week, so we'll have a look at that as well. So here's the table for mallards and black ducks that we're accustomed to looking at now. The blues are really what we're looking for, right? But we still continue to get these oranges in here, which are really rare for this time of the season at all. Again, past North Dakota, there's really not a lot of things that are making mallards move. If they're moving, it might be based on local food conditions, water conditions, as well as disturbance. They still do redistribute because of other reasons other than weather. But if we look towards the Atlantic Flyway on the right side, as you can see, there's an abundance of or lack of the blue color, which would be the beyond the threshold where we would see a decreasing abundance. So not much movement of mallards really expected for the coming week. For pintails, it gets a bit better, right? We've got a little bit of movement of those birds. We already saw a pretty good movement of those birds out of the east in the Great Lakes region, but another shot of cold to cause some more movement of pintails. And then as we look west into the Mississippi Flyway, we actually see some conditions cold enough again later, like Thursday. I think that's Wednesday, Thursday-ish in as far south there as Ohio, with some movement of birds in the eastern side of the Mississippi Flyway. But again, a lot of back and forth with the cold, little shots of cold and then warm ups. If you look at Green Bay, it's just like one cold day or two cold days, and then warms back up. So just nothing major really. Trickle of birds. For Gadwall, we're starting to see, right, the east is cooling back off. We start to see those Canada and Great Lakes numbers turn blue. What's happening in Iowa is that mallards now comprise a bulk of the birds. There's about, I think, something around 75% of the birds in Iowa right now are mallards. And so because we continue to get these 4-5 day shots of cold that cause decreases that far south. But as soon as we get to, say, Columbus, Ohio, Memphis, Tennessee, Washington, D.C., and Charlotte, North Carolina, there's really not much going on. So these birds are, some of them have trickled down into the southern latitudes, but a lot of them right now are stacked up at mid latitudes. Very similar, right? For shoveler, a little more sensitive. We see they're just moving a little bit more quickly. But even in Columbus, Ohio, or mid latitude Ohio, those thresholds are barely past those numbers are barely past the threshold. So we don't expect a lot of movement. Again, in the east, we're starting to pick up some cold early in the week. That cumulative effect of cold over time on these smaller body dabbling ducks, as long as they have got enough fuel or fat buildup from feeding in high quality habitats to go south, they're ready to go right now. So we'll start to see movement of those birds out. And then Wigeon and Green-winged teal are our most sensitive. So we see their threshold is -10 WSI, which is a mean temperature of 10 degrees Celsius for a given 5-day period of time. So we see that again. We see a little more movement of these birds out of Iowa, Ohio, and then Canada and the Great Lakes region in the States. And if we take a look, let's dissect Wigeon and Green-winged teal a little bit here and compare it to past years. So for Des Moines, Iowa, if we make a comparison, what we see that heavy dotted line is the threshold. The open circles are the WSI values for this year, and the dark closed circles are the WSI for 2019. And what we see is we go back a little ways, we see that the WSI in 2019 and 2020 around day 20 when we started this, which is October 20th, crossed that line pretty quickly, and that was that first cold front. And those two events kind of happened about 7 days apart. That little blip there of 2019 at first was probably not a huge movement of birds, but in 2020 it went pretty cold pretty quick, and then about 7 days later it happened in 2019. The difference is in 2019 it stayed worse than that. The weather severity stayed worse than that threshold the whole entire time after. In 2020 it dropped back down, but it's not for that long. And my guess is that there's really not a lot of Wigeon and Green-winged teal remaining at this latitude. If we look at Syracuse, New York, we actually have most of our Wigeon and Green-winged teal are gone from our area. A lot of them have already moved on. I mean, there are still some around, but the major push of them is gone. In 2020, again, these open circles, we had enough movement, or sorry, enough weather severity early to make them move out. Again, about a week earlier than in 2019. But once they left in 2019, boy, they were gone, because that got really severe really quick in 2019, and that was with the snow and cold that I showed you there on those snow cover maps previously. But and again, we drop below the threshold, but there's some of these birds around, but not a lot. When we contrast this with Columbus, Ohio, which is a little south of Des Moines and Syracuse and sits in between them, what we see is that in 2019, the WSI went kind of off the charts. Again, it was that real strong cold front and that snow that came through that I showed previously on those snow cover charts. But in 2020, the WSI has gotten just worse than needed to move these birds out of that latitude of Columbus, Ohio. And then again this week. So there'll be like these small movements of those birds out. But I'd expect that Wigeon and Green-winged teal continue to have some level of composition of harvest at those more mid latitudes. That those birds are still there. There's points when their numbers are decreasing, but not to any great extent, so that they're not still available to hunters. So that's kind of a feel for what's going on right now. I think birds should be stacking up at mid latitudes at this point as they slowly trickle in. The hunting can be good to moderate is my expectation. Not a ton of new naive birds each week. So what you got to do is, reduce disturbance a little bit, hunt less. Hunting 2 to 3 days a week at a location provides quality hunting rather than just open opportunity. 7 days a week with not many new naive birds creates smart birds very quickly. And giving several days for naive birds to build up in number before hunting them may produce a higher quality hunt. So that would be my recommendation at this point at mid latitudes, is not to pound away at them every single day of the week. We look at river gauges, as I said, some drastic changes. This week is on the left, last week on the right. We had weather, right, that came through Florida and then up the Atlantic coast. And then we had some rain systems in the upper Great Lakes, which really raised rivers. We got a little bit of relief again in the Great Lakes region and upper Midwest, but we still do see a lot of really strong drought conditions there. What's happened though in the southern tier states, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and such, is that those river gauges are about the same, or have actually kind of declined to some extent. Probably a lot of river management Corps of Engineers trying to steady the water up there some. So as far as the conditions where birds would be really, really spread out at this time, unless we get another tropical storm, conditions might be reasonable for when ducks do show up at southern latitudes. The water might not be overabundant in too many places. Now, obviously, Virginia, North Carolina, and in the mid-Atlantic coast is slammed with water. And so birds just are going to have a ton of options in that part of the world when they do get there. So as you can see, just comparing the two, there's a lot of pretty drastic changes in some locations in the over the last week. So keep an eye always on these river gauges. They're important for overall hunting success once the birds get to your latitude, usually, as to how they can disperse. Okay, that's it, folks. Remember to email me your questions at weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. As I noted, it would help me if you did subscribe. All you got to do is click the subscribe button. It doesn't steal any data or do anything weird like that. If you have a Gmail account, you should be getting the YouTube channel alerts when I do post a new video. I do these weekly until the end of January. So have a good week. Sunbird movement coming. Hunt the cold. Be safe and shoot straight. Thanks for listening.